Imagine you're sitting in church on a Sunday morning, listening to the pastor deliver his sermon, and all of a sudden he just announces that his wife has passed away,
Hmm.
and then he reveals that it was a suicide, and he asked everyone to leave quietly and to not talk about it.
Oh, wow.
That's the really unsettling scene that unfolded in this case of Micah Miller, and today we're diving deep into the events around her death to try and understand what happened.
You're right. That initial scene is so jarring. It's not something you would expect from a grieving husband, let alone a spiritual leader. From the very beginning, there's a sense of unease, almost a feeling that something isn't right.
Yeah, that's exactly it, and that feeling only intensifies as we get deeper into this case.
Yeah.
Micah Miller was a 30-year-old woman who was married to Pastor John Paul Miller, and while her death was officially ruled a suicide, a bunch of really suspicious circumstances has left many people questioning that ruling.
Right.
So we're going to unpack the timeline, examine those different narratives, look at all those key details that have fueled public speculation and concern.
What I find so fascinating about this case is the way that it challenges our assumptions about suicide.
Hmm.
We often think of suicide as this deeply personal and private act, but in this case, it's intertwined with all of these allegations of abuse and control and just this deeply unsettling, very public announcement.
Yeah, it's a really unusual case for sure.
Absolutely.
So let's start with just the basics. Micah was found dead on April 27th, 2024 at Lumber River State Park in North Carolina.
Okay.
The cause of death was ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and we even have this really chilling 911 call where you can hear Micah stating her intention to end her life and her desire for her family to be the ones to find her.
And that 911 call, combined with the police timeline that shows Micah purchasing a gun and driving to the park that same day, seems to really support that official ruling of suicide.
Right.
But then you have John Paul Miller's behavior, the sermon announcement, everything else that comes out later, and it doesn't add up. It's like looking at two totally different pictures.
It's like a puzzle where some of the pieces fit, but then some of them are from a completely different puzzle.
Exactly.
Let's talk about that sermon announcement for a second. Why do you think it caused such a strong reaction and fueled so much of that suspicion from the start?
Well, put yourself in the shoes of someone in the congregation who has just heard their pastor, their spiritual guide, announce his wife's death in this really detached manner and then discourage any discussion about it.
Yeah,
It goes against every norm we have around grief and empathy, and it just makes you question, what he might be hiding.
it sets a strange tone for sure. And then you start to uncover details about their relationship, Micah and John Paul's relationship,
Yeah.
and it gets even more complicated. So just 12 days before Micah died, she actually filed for separation from John Paul.
Wow.
And in the year before that, she'd filed 3 separate requests for support and maintenance.
Oh, wow.
Not exactly the picture of a happy marriage.
No, not at all. Those details suggest a very different story than the one that John Paul was presenting in his sermon. It seems like this was a marriage that was falling apart, a woman who was trying to break free. And then when you add in Micah's reports of her tires being slashed and that tracking device that was found on her car, well, it starts to feel more like something out of a thriller movie.
It does.
Yeah.
And then there's that police report where Micah expresses fear for her life.
Mm-hmm.
And she mentioned an individual that she was trying to avoid.
Yeah.
It wasn't specifically stated, but many people thought that John Paul was that individual that she was so afraid of.
Yeah, I can see why. And that suspicion becomes even stronger when you consider the affidavit from Micah's sister.
Right.
She alleges that John Paul was abusive and violent towards Micah, and that Micah had confided in her about being followed and having personal belongings removed from their home.
That's heavy stuff.
It is. These are serious accusations, and it raises a really important question. Could Micah have been driven to suicide by this pattern of abuse and control?
And then we have to look at that chilling statement that Micah reportedly made to her sister. If I end up with a bullet in my head, it was not by me. It was JP.
Yeah, that's a really hard statement to ignore. But you can't help but feel that there might be something more to this story than what we see on the surface.
Right.
It makes you question the nature of their relationship, the possibility that there was coercion involved, and just the difficulty of proving emotional abuse.
Absolutely. So let's shift gears for a second and talk about John Paul's past.
Okay.
There were allegations that he was grooming Micah when she was much younger,
Mm-hmm.
back when he was a youth leader and actually married to another woman.
Right.
And similar accusations even came from a previous girlfriend as well.
It's interesting how those past allegations, regardless of whether they're true or not, start to paint this picture of John Paul as someone who might be manipulative and controlling, and it's hard to shake that image once you've heard those stories.
It does make you wonder if he could have been using his position to manipulate or control Micah.
especially given the sermons where he seemed to be indirectly addressing their situation.
Right.
It definitely raises questions about what his intentions were and the dynamics that might have been at play within their marriage.
It's almost like we're watching this domino effect with each new piece of information
Hmm?
leading us further away from a simple explanation.
I guess you said
Then you have Micah's own actions and words leading up to her death.
it. Right.
She posted these videos on Facebook talking about abuse in relationships and alluding to her struggles.
Mm-hmm.
Her friends shared stories about her expressing fear and these weird, suspicious events that were happening.
Right.
And one friend actually said that she talked to Micah the night before her death, and they discussed Micah's plans for the future and her efforts to get out of this marriage.
It's so sad. These accounts really paint this picture of a woman who felt trapped in a toxic situation, desperately trying to find a way out. It gives us a glimpse into what her state of mind might have been and all the challenges she was facing. It's a completely different narrative than that simple suicide story.
It really is. It's heartbreaking to think about what she must have been going through.
Hmm.
But then we also have that 911 call.
Yeah.
We hear her intention to end her own life. How do we reconcile those two seemingly opposite narratives?
That's the core of this case, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have evidence that suggests suicide, but then we have this mountain of other information that seems to point toward a much darker and more complex story.
It's a really difficult balance to strike because we don't want to just dismiss the possibility of suicide, but we can't ignore that potential role of abuse and control either.
And this is where I think understanding the nuances of emotional and psychological abuse becomes crucial. You see, even if we don't have concrete evidence of murder, it's entirely possible for someone to be driven to suicide because they've been subjected to prolonged manipulation and control.
That's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder how common it is for victims of emotional abuse to feel so trapped and hopeless that suicide seems like their only way out.
It's more common than we might like to think, unfortunately. Emotional abuse can be incredibly insidious. It chips away at a person's sense of self, their confidence, and their ability to see a way out of their situation. It can make them feel completely powerless.
You're right. It's almost like an invisible prison where the bars are made of manipulation, isolation, and fear.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of feeling trapped, I remember in one of Micah's videos, she mentioned being forced to take illegal drugs. Was that ever confirmed by any official report?
That's a great question. And it's one that unfortunately we don't have a clear answer to. The specifics of any toxicology report weren't included in the sources we have for this deep dive. However, if such a report does exist, it would certainly be a critical piece of the puzzle. It could potentially shed light on Micah's mental state at the time and whether there were any external factors like forced drug use that were contributing to her distress.
It's frustrating that we're missing that piece of the puzzle. So here's what we have, a seemingly clear-cut suicide based on that 911 call and the police timeline, but also this unsettling pattern of alleged abuse, control, and fear that seemed to define Micah's life leading up to her death. It's a real conundrum.
Absolutely. It really highlights the limitations of relying solely on hard evidence. Sometimes the facts alone simply can't tell the whole story. We need to consider the context, the patterns of behavior, and the invisible wounds that emotional abuse can inflict.
You're right, those invisible wounds can be just as debilitating as physical ones. This case makes me think about the burden of proof in situations like this. If someone is driven to suicide because of years of emotional manipulation and abuse, is that considered a crime? And how do you even begin to prove that kind of influence in a legal setting?
Those are the million-dollar questions that legal systems around the world are still grappling with. Proving coercion in suicide cases is incredibly challenging, even when there's a clear history of documented abuse. It often comes down to expert testimony piecing together a mosaic of circumstantial evidence and trying to interpret the victim's state of mind.
It seems like an almost impossible task. It must be incredibly frustrating for families and loved ones seeking justice in these cases.
Yeah.
You know, this case really underscores the complexity of dealing with issues like mental health, domestic abuse, and the dynamics of power, especially in a religious setting. It's not about finding a simple, easy answer. It's about acknowledging the human tragedy at the heart of it all.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a tragedy with implications that extend far beyond this one case. It compels us to have broader conversations about the hidden nature of abuse, the difficulties of proving emotional harm, and our collective responsibility as a society to support those who are suffering.
We can't just sweep these things under the rug. It's so easy to get caught up in the headlines and the sensationalism of a case like this. But we need to remember that behind every story, behind every statistic, there are real people, real lives, and real pain. In Micah's case, even though we have all this information, we still might never know the full truth of what happened.
That's the unsettling reality of cases like this, isn't it? They challenge us to look beyond the surface, to question easy answers, and to acknowledge that sometimes the truth can be incredibly elusive.
Cases like this also force us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society. They make us question what we're willing to see, what we're willing to believe, and how we respond to situations where the lines between right and wrong, victim and perpetrator, truth and deception are blurred.
You're absolutely right. They make us confront the complexities of human behavior, the limitations of our justice system, and the painful reality that sometimes, even when we have all the pieces, the puzzle never quite fits together perfectly.
This whole situation is so heartbreaking, and the more we delve into it, the more questions we seem to have.
Mm.
But there's one thing that's clear. Micah's story deserves to be heard. It's a story that speaks to larger issues of power control abuse and the silent struggles so many people face.
I couldn't agree more. It's a story that compels us to listen more deeply, to question more critically, and to act more compassionately.
And to remember that while we might never have all the answers, the pursuit of truth and justice is a journey worth taking. Micah's case, with all its uncertainties and complexities, serves as a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that we must be vigilant in recognizing the signs of abuse, both for ourselves and for those around us.
It's a reminder that we need to be more aware, more empathetic, and more willing to speak out against injustice wherever we see it.
Even though the official ruling was suicide, and we have that 911 call where Micah states her intentions, there's still so many unanswered questions. Did the years of alleged emotional manipulation and control contribute to her decision? Did she truly feel like she had no other way out?
Those are incredibly difficult questions to grapple with, and I think they highlight the fact that even in a seemingly straightforward case, there can be layers of complexity and nuance that we may never fully understand.
It's those unanswered questions that often stay with us long after the headlines fade. They challenge us to think critically, to question easy assumptions, and to recognize that sometimes the pursuit of justice isn't about finding definitive answers, but about acknowledging the complexities of a situation and honoring the memory of those who have been lost.
Beautifully said. It's about recognizing the human element in every story, the messy, complicated, and often heartbreaking realities that shape our lives and the lives of those around us.
On that note, I think it's important to emphasize that if you or someone you know is struggling with domestic abuse, please reach out for help. There are resources available, people who care, and support systems that can help guide you through these incredibly difficult situations. You are not alone.
That's such an important message to reiterate. There is hope, there is help, and there is a path forward, even in the darkest of times.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how we approach cases like this. We need to be really careful not to just accept things at face value, especially when it comes to something as complex and as nuanced as emotional abuse.
Right. It's not always as straightforward as physical abuse. It's not always going to be a black eye or a broken arm. But the damage can be just as severe, just as long-lasting.
It's hard to prove, too. It's like trying to prove that a ghost exists. You can sense it, you can feel it, but it's almost impossible to capture any real evidence.
And when there's no concrete evidence, it's easy for people to just dismiss it, to doubt the victim, or to just look the other way and pretend it's not happening.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Hmm.
That's why it's so important for us to talk about these issues, to raise awareness and fight that stigma around mental health and emotional abuse. We have to make it clear that it's safe to talk about these things and that people will be believed and supported when they do.
I couldn't agree more.
I think Micah's story really highlights the power dynamics that can be at play in situations like this. John Paul was a pastor, a spiritual leader, a figure of authority. It makes you think about how that power might have been used or misused in their relationship.
It's a really important observation. Power dynamics are so complex, and in a setting like a church where there's this built-in imbalance of power, it's easy to see how someone might abuse that position.
For sure. And it's a reminder that abuse can happen anywhere.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what your job is, what your social status is, or your religious beliefs. No one is immune to it.
That's so true.
Micah's story also shows us that we can't always just rely on the official narrative, what's presented by the authorities. Sometimes there are hidden truths, silenced voices, and different perspectives that get overlooked.
Exactly. We need to be willing to question the information that we're given, to think critically, and to be open to the idea that there might be more to the story than what we initially see or hear.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Micah Miller case, what are the main points you hope people take away from this conversation?
Well, for me, it comes down to this. We all have a responsibility to be more aware of the signs of abuse, to be more empathetic and compassionate towards those who are suffering, and to work towards creating a culture where people feel safe to come forward and share their experiences.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Even when it feels like we don't have all the answers or the truth is hard to find, it's important to keep asking questions, to keep searching for understanding, and to fight for justice for those who've been silenced.
Perfectly said. It's about recognizing the human element in every story and acknowledging those messy, complicated realities that shape our lives.
And on that note, I want to say again that if you or someone you know is struggling with domestic abuse, please reach out for help. You're not alone. There are people who care, and there are resources available to support you.
There's always hope. Remember that. There is help and there's always a way forward, no matter how dark things might seem.
That's a great message to end on. Thank you so much for joining us today for this deep dive. It's been a heavy conversation, but an important one.
It really has. I appreciate you having me.
And to all of our listeners out there, thank you for tuning in to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.